You can visit us on our website at calhounchurchofchrist.com. That's calhounchurchofchrist.com, where you will find a lot more biblical content in the form of articles and more videos like this one. If you have any questions or comments about this video, you can email me, John, at calhounchurchofchrist@gmail.com. Email me if you would also like to start up an online Bible study or receive an online correspondence course. Again, that's John at calhounchurchofchrist@gmail.com. If you ask any religious person on the street to name some of the more famous personalities in the Bible, you're probably going to get someone really quickly who will mention the name of David. I think that it is unquestionable that David is among the most well-known characters in the Bible. Now, it should be remembered, though, that he did not live his life by himself. When you read 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel, you'll see that the story of David really is the story of his interaction with other personalities, other people who lived during his time. One of the most prominent and influential people in David's life was a man by the name of Joab. Now, Joab is a Hebrew name that literally means Jehovah or Yahweh is father. In 1 Chronicles chapter 2, verse 16, you can read that Joab was one of 3 sons of the sister of David, Zeruiah. And so Joab was related to David. Now, Joab had 2 brothers, Abishai and Asahel. Now, the Bible doesn't give us the name of Joab's father. The historian Josephus says that Joab's father's name was Suri. What we do know from the Bible is that Joab's father was buried in the town of Bethlehem. You can read that in 2 Samuel chapter 2, verse 32. Now, other than this, there's a lot of unanswered questions we would have about Joab. We don't know anything about his early childhood. We don't know anything about his youth. We do know that he had close family connections with David. Again, he is the son of David's sister. So I think it's reasonable for us to conclude that Joab would have been aware of some of the great deeds that David did in his life. Joab probably had heard about how David killed Goliath, for example. We don't know exactly how Joab came to occupy such an influential position in David's kingdom, but as we're going to see in this study, Joab did play a very prominent role in David's administration. Joab was a military man, he was a soldier, he was a leader, and he accomplished quite a lot in David's military. For example, open up your Bibles to 2 Samuel chapter 8, and we're going to start with verse 16. I'm just going to give you an overview of what these passages say. In 2 Samuel chapter 8, verse 16, we read that Joab the son of Zeruiah was over the host of David's military. Now, the path that Joab took to get to this position where he was over the host of David's military, where he was basically the commander of David's military, that path that Joab took to get there, that tells us quite a lot about the kind of person that Joab was. Joab, without a doubt, was a man who had a lot of ambition. He most certainly had serious aspirations of greatness. When David became king, we read in the Bible that he wanted to conquer a city named Jebus. Now, Jebus is the same city that would later be known as Jerusalem. And so in 1 Chronicles chapter 11, verse 6, David says to his soldiers, "Whoever strikes down the Jebusites first shall be chief and commander." Now the passage goes on to say, and Joab the son of Zeruiah went up first, so he became chief. So that says a lot about Joab's courage. It also says a lot about his initiative. And, the courage that Joab had, the initiative that he had, we can appreciate that. It was a pretty good thing. It's an example to us all, yes. But as we're going to see in this study, the rest of the story of Joab's life reveals a lot of things that are a bad example to us, example that we should not follow. His actions, as we will see, were almost always inseparably connected with his desire to be number one, with his desire to be chief. See, Joab had an agenda, and it was a self promoting agenda. And we're going to see that in our study today of his life and see what lessons we can learn from it. The New Testament says about the Old Testament nation of Israel that what we read about in the Old Testament happened to Israel as an example to us, and it was written to admonish us. 1 Kings chapter 10, verse 11. The Old Testament, what's written in it, is written to instruct us, as Paul says in Romans chapter 15, verse 4. So when we study this Old Testament figure of Joab, there's a lot that we can apply to our relationship with God, to our life as a Christian, and this can help us to be better followers of God. Now, in talking about Joab's ambition to be first, that ambition was advanced. It was advanced by the very keen military skills that Joab possessed, because again, he was an accomplished soldier. He was a very, very good military strategist. In 2 Samuel chapter 2, if you read verses 13 and 14, on one occasion, you'll see that Joab and the servants of David, they assembled at the pool of Gibeon. And he was challenged to a fight by the leader of Saul's army. That would be a man by the name of Abner. So Joab agreed. And so in 2 Samuel chapter 2, you can read about this in verses 13 through 17. We see that Joab's men soundly defeated Abner's men. In fact, verses 30 and 31 bring out that when everything was said and done, when the battle was completed, Joab had only lost 20 soldiers, while Abner had lost 360 men. Now, if you go to chapter 8 of 2 Samuel, 2 Samuel chapter 8, and you look at verses 13 through 14, we'll read that during David's military campaign into the territory of the Edomites, we read that Joab spent 6 months cutting off every male in Edom except for the Edomites who had escaped, as 1 Kings chapter 11, verses 15 and 16 bring out. If you go to 2 Samuel chapter 10, you'll read that on another occasion, the Ammonites had humiliated some of David's soldiers. The Ammonites had taken some of David's men, and they had shaved off half their beards. They had cut their clothes down the middle so that their backsides would be revealed. This would be extremely embarrassing and humiliating. And so the Ammonites, they were afraid that David would retaliate because of this, and they had good reason to be afraid because David was going to retaliate because of this. And so what the Ammonites did was they decided to make allies with the Syrians. Kind of like a defensive measure, as it were. But David did retaliate. In 2 Samuel chapter 10, if you look at verse 7, it says that when David heard about how the Ammonites had treated his men, it says he sent Joab and all the host of the mighty men. He sent Joab and Joab's soldiers to basically take care of the Ammonites for this insult. Now, Joab was definitely up to the task. And if you look at verse 9 of 2 Samuel 10, you'll see that when Joab saw that the battle was not going his way, both in front and in the rear, he decided to change his strategy. He decided to take some of the best men of Israel and array them against the Syrians. And this was a brilliant military strategy because Joab knew that if he could cause the Syrians to retreat, then these Ammonites, who didn't have the courage, they didn't have the strength to fight on their own. If the Syrians retreated, then the Ammonites would also retreat. And so what Joab decided to do was put his best soldiers that he had into the fight against the Syrians, and the rest of the soldiers he put under the command of his brother Abishai. Now, look at 2 Samuel chapter 10, verse 11. Look at verse 11. Before going out into battle, Joab gave his brother Abishai some very wise counsel. He said, "If the Syrians are too strong for me, then you shall help me. But if the Ammonites are too strong for you, then I will come and help you." Now, look at verse 12. The next statement that Joab made to Abishai shows just how brave Joab was. It also showed that Joab did have concern for other people, and yes, Joab did have confidence in the providence of God. Verse 12, he says to Abishai, "Be of good courage, and let us be courageous for our people and for the cities of our God, and may the Lord do what seems good to him." So apparently there were times that, at least on the surface, Joab was a man who believed in God and trusted in God. So if you go to verses 13 and 14 of 2 Samuel 10, you'll see that when the battle finally commenced, Joab's plan worked, and it worked brilliantly. Joab brought the battle to the Syrians, and the Syrians fled before him. The Bible says, "And when the Ammonites saw that the Syrians fled, they likewise fled before Abishai and entered the city." And so Joab wins the battle. He returns to Jerusalem as a war hero. And if you go to chapter 11 of 2 Samuel, verse 1, it says, "In the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle, David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel, and they ravaged the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained at Jerusalem." And if you keep reading in chapter 11, because David remained in Jerusalem, that is why he would later commit adultery with Bathsheba. And we're going to talk more about that in a second. But for now, let me point out that it's clear that David never had any doubts whatsoever about Joab's ability to lead David's army into battle. But with that said, David would discover that there would be plenty of reasons to doubt Joab's motives and his methods. You see, Joab had an agenda. And what David would end up learning was that for all of Joab's military accomplishments, David would always have an underlying problem with Joab, and that was Joab's hidden agenda. Joab was very talented. He was a talented soldier, but he was driven first and foremost by an agenda of promoting himself. Joab was not about to let anyone or anything stop him from carrying out this agenda, even if it meant bloodshed. Episode after episode in Joab's life proves this to be true. Let me give you an example. Go back to chapter 2 of 1 Samuel. In 1 Samuel chapter 2, in the first 9 verses of chapter 2, we will read that after the death of King Saul, the men of Judah anointed David as king in the city of Hebron. But meanwhile, Abner, and you'll remember Abner was the captain of Saul's military, Abner took Saul's son, Ishbosheth, and Abner made Ishbosheth king over the rest of the tribes of Israel. And so here you have David, he's king of Judah, but Ishbosheth is king over the other 11 tribes of Israel. So for 2 years, Ishbosheth reigns over Israel, and David reigns over all of Judah. And now in chapter 2 of 2 Samuel, if you read verses 12 through 17, you'll read that one day the servants of Saul, and again Abner's their commander, and the servants of David, with Joab as their commander, they assembled at the same time at the pool of Gibeon. We referred to this a few minutes ago in this lesson. Abner suggests a contest to Joab, let's have a contest between the soldiers on both of our sides. Now, the Bible doesn't go into the exact nature of the contest, but we do know that Joab agreed, and so him and Abner, they selected 12 men to represent both of their armies. Now, apparently, if you look at verse 16 of 2 Samuel chapter 2, you'll see that the contest ended in a massacre on both sides, because the Bible says in verse 16, and each caught his opponent by the head and thrust his sword in his opponent's side, so they fell down together. Now, this caused both armies to react. And if you look at verse 17, it says, and the battle was very fierce that day, and Abner and the men of Israel were beaten before the servants of David. So the 24 men, apparently it was a tie. They all killed each other. But the battle that came after that had a clear victor. Abner, as I mentioned before, lost 360 men. David only lost 20 soldiers. But here's the thing. One of those casualties on David's side, the 20 men who died, was Joab's brother Asahel. And Asahel's death set in motion a series of events that would really strain the relationship between David and Joab for the rest of their lives. Look at verses 18 through 28 of 2 Samuel chapter 2. You read that Abner, he realizes that he and his men are losing the battle. So Abner takes off. He's fleeing. He's running from the battle scene. And Joab's brother Asahel, it says in the Bible that Asahel could run very fast as a gazelle. So Asahel is pursuing Abner. Now Abner's running. He looks back over his shoulder and he sees Asahel pursuing him, and he recognizes Asahel. And so Abner urges Asahel, hey, Asahel, you need to fight one of these younger, inexperienced soldiers. You need to stop chasing me and fight someone else. Now, here's the thing. Asahel was a lot quicker than Abner, but Asahel was not a seasoned soldier. Abner knew that Asahel was no match for him in hand-to-hand combat. Abner apparently did not want to have to kill Asahel. And I think Abner also knew that Joab would come after him if he killed his brother. Joab would want revenge, and Abner did not want Joab to be on his tail for the rest of his life. And so verses 21 through 22, Abner, he pleads with Asahel at least twice, just back off, go fight someone else. But you see, Asahel, he wouldn't listen, he would not retreat. And so now Abner has no choice but to defend himself. And so what he does is Abner waits until Asahel is right behind him, and then Abner, he thrusts the other end of his spear backwards right into Asahel's midsection. You look at verse 23. Verse 23 says that the force of that collision, it sent Abner's spear, and keep in mind, Abner's spear was sharpened to a very sharp point, even on the lower end. It sent Abner's spear right through Asahel's body, literally stopping him dead in his tracks. He was killed. Now, as anticipated, Joab and his other brother, Abishai, they went after Abner. They chased Abner, but they were unable to catch him by the end of the day. And by the time they did catch up to him, he wasn't alone anymore. He had reinforcements. But we also read that Abner did not want to fight, and so he offers Joab a truce. Maybe sensing that battle conditions were not as favorable as they were before, Joab agrees to a ceasefire. So the battle's over, but that did not cease Joab's hostility towards Abner's. Now, the ceasefire didn't last long between Saul's forces and David's forces. They very quickly went back to war. But if you look at chapter 3 of 2 Samuel, verse 1, you'll read that David, his forces, grew stronger while Saul's army grew weaker. We will also read in chapter 3 that Abner would remain loyal to Saul's son Ishbosheth until one day Ishbosheth falsely accused Abner of going into one of his father's concubines. Now this hurt Abner's feelings, and he was so hurt by this that Abner decides to switch sides. He deserts Ishbosheth and Saul, and he goes to join David. So what Abner does is he sends messengers to notify David of his change of heart, and he's wanting an alliance with David. He promises David, "Hey, if you take me in and you let me be on your side, I will turn the all of Israel to your side." So David agrees to this alliance, and so Abner starts keeping his word. Abner begins to persuade the men of Israel to abandon Ishbosheth and to have David as their king. So Abner comes to Hebron. He has a personal meeting with David. David is very gracious to him. He even goes so far as to prepare a party for Abner. And so this is a very positive meeting. The meeting ends on good terms, and David sends Abner out to gather all of Israel to join with David. Now, where's Joab in all this? Well, what we read is that meanwhile, Joab is coming back. He's victorious in the battlefield, but when he gets back and he learns that Abner is here, the man who killed his brother Asahel, and that Abner has actually been feasting with David, and that Abner has just left, and David allows him to leave, and he leaves in peace, well, that really puts Joab in a very, very bad mood. What Joab sees here is an opportunity, a perfect opportunity to get vengeance on his brother Asahel. He sees David. He said, "Well, David's just totally dropped the ball. This was a perfect opportunity to kill Abner and get revenge on what Abner did to me. David's not going to do it, so I'm going to do it." That's the way that Joab saw it. Now, let's go to chapter 3 of 2 Samuel. And if you look at verses 20 through 30, 2 Samuel 3, verses 20 through 30, you see that Joab, he comes to the king, he comes to David, and he basically says to David, "David, what have you done here?" And what he's doing here is scolding David for, he's saying to David, "David, you're not bright enough to see that Abner is nothing more than a liar and a spy." Now, the Bible doesn't say how David replied to all this, how he reacted to this, but I think it's obvious that David held a different opinion than Joab did. He was willing to take Abner at his word. He thought that Abner was sincere, that Abner was going to benefit David by bringing the whole country under David's rule. So Joab, he leaves David, and apparently somehow he gets Abner to come back under some innocent pretext. David's not aware of this, of Joab getting Abner to come back. So Abner comes back, and once Abner comes back, we see that Joab, he kind of takes him aside privately and quietly, and then what does Joab do? He stabs Abner to death to get revenge on Abner killing his brother Asahel. Now it's clear that David had no intentions whatsoever of doing anything negative to Abner. But Joab doesn't care. In spite of this, Joab, he decides to completely ignore the authority of his king, and he decides to take matters into his own hands. You see, Joab had an agenda. His agenda was, I'm going to get revenge. I don't care what David thinks. I don't care if this will hurt David's cause. All I care about is what I want. That was Joab's agenda, and he was going to carry out that agenda. And if it was different from the king's agenda, Joab doesn't care. He's going to do it anyway. Christians, in looking at what Joab did here, we can see some of the tactics that are commonly used by people who have an agenda, and how they go and what they do to go about accomplishing that agenda. You see, people who have an agenda, they're not hesitant to disobey those who are in authority. They're not hesitant to rebel against people who are in authority over them if they want to accomplish what they want to do. Joab, when he sent messengers to call Abner back to Hebron, verse 26 says that he did so behind the back of his king, the one who had authority over him, David. Joab knew that David would never give him permission to do what he wanted to do. So Joab just decides to do it himself. We see people with agendas doing the exact same thing, rebelling against those in authority. We see that happening in our country today, in our society, and in our culture. We also see it in the church. Today, some in the church are obsessed with advancing their own agendas. And if it is to the detriment of the church, their congregation, their brethren, they don't care. They want to have their way. And they'll use the same tactics that Joab used here. They will not hesitate to rebel against people who are in authority over them in order to accomplish their purposes. They don't care. They're not bashful to rebel against the will of godly elderships if it's going to cause them to accomplish what they want to do. Hebrews chapter 13, verse 17 tells us all to submit to our leaders in the church. But you see, those with an agenda, they don't want to do that. And so what they do is they rebel against those who are in authority so that they can accomplish their own desires. Another thing that Joab teaches us here is that people with an agenda, they're often willing to use deceit to accomplish their goals. Again, what did the messengers of Joab say to Abner to cause Abner to come back? Well, maybe they told him that David had thought of something else that he wanted to discuss with Abner. Maybe they told Abner that David had decided that he wanted Abner to meet with Joab to discuss the transition of power. We don't know. Who knows what Joab told them to tell Abner, but whatever they told him accomplished the goal of getting Abner to come back. Today, there are some within the church who are willing to use deceit to accomplish their goals. That's what people who have an agenda, a personal agenda that is all about themselves, that's what people who have an agenda do. They're willing to use deceit to bring about what they want. Brethren who have an agenda, they will distort the truth, even though it's the truth. They'll distort it anyway if they find it necessary to accomplish their agenda, even if it means turning brethren against other brethren. And we see this happening in our country and in our society today too. It is very, very sad, Christians, if a Christian can just very warmly shake his brother's right hand in fellowship, and yet, figuratively speaking, in the other hand he has behind his back has a dagger, and he's willing to stab his brother in the back. It's very, very sad when Christians are willing to work behind the scenes by exaggerating things, embellishing things, or even out and out lying to fulfill their own agendas over the ones who have authority in the church. Another thing that Joab teaches us is that if you have an agenda, a lot of times you're willing to destroy others to get what you want. Now, in this case, Joab, his agenda is he wanted Abner dead. Now, and you could say, well, I can't really blame him because Abner had killed his brother Asahel. But remember, Abner killed Asahel on the battlefield in self-defense. It was not a premeditated, cold-blooded murder. Abner was even pleading with Asahel, man, leave me alone. You don't want to go up against me. Go find someone else. He was pleading with him several times. Even if Joab thought that Abner deserved punishment for what he did to Joab's brother on the battlefield, remember, Joab did not have the authority to carry out his own version of vigilante justice. What the Bible clearly indicates in this story is that Joab's primary reason for killing Abner was because he wanted revenge for the death of his brother. 2 Samuel chapter 3, verse 27 and verse 30 makes that very clear. Now, I will say that it's not impossible for Joab to have had a secondary agenda in murdering Abner. He might have had another reason that went beyond just pure revenge over his brother's death. It is true that Joab was David's military commander. He could have seen that Abner, who was also a military commander in his own right, he could see that Abner was getting really close to David, and so maybe Joab thought that Abner was a potential threat a potential rival for Joab's own position of being commander over David's army. Now, Joab, as we will see in this study of his life, all Joab cared about was promoting himself. And there's no room for qualified men like Abner to be at the beck and call of the king, because that could put Joab out of business, as it were. Abner could take Joab's place as commander of David's armies. And he already hated Abner for what he did to his brother. Maybe Joab has another reason to want to kill Abner so that Joab's career could continue to move forward. And that teaches us something as well. Today, there are people in our country and in our culture, and there are some in the church who are willing to destroy other people, willing to destroy the country, willing to destroy the church. If that will mean that they will get what they want. It is very, very sad that some people are more concerned about their own personal advancement, or they're more concerned about retaliating against those who have hurt their feelings than they are concerned about peace and harmony and unity within the congregation, within the brotherhood, or within our society. Like Joab, they basically become assassins. Now, Joab was a literal assassin. He literally shed blood. Not everyone becomes a literal assassin, of course, but you can easily become a figurative one by engaging in character assassination. And I have seen that happen in the church and in our society. Now let's continue with our study. When David learns that Joab and his brother had killed Abner, David's appalled. If you look at verses 28 and 29 of 2 Samuel chapter 3, you'll read that David publicized that David and his kingdom were guiltless in this action. And David said basically that all responsibility for Abner's murder should, quote, fall upon the head of Joab and upon all his father's house. David goes on to say, and may the house of Joab never be without one who has a discharge, or who is leprous, or who holds a spindle, or who falls by the sword, or who lacks bread. And then David commands Joab and all the people with him to at least have the courtesy to tear their clothes and put on sackcloth and mourn Abner. We read that in verse 31. Now, when Abner is buried, at Abner's funeral, we read in verse 34 that David expresses his grief that Abner had fallen. But notice how David puts it. David says that Abner had fallen before the wicked. Before the wicked. That tells us how David was looking at Joab and Abishai. And then look at verse 39. David says, these men, the sons of Zeruiah, that would be Joab and Abishai, they are more severe than I. The Lord repay the evildoer according to his wickedness. So David recognizes what Joab has done, and he calls Joab out for being evil here. Now, regrettably, this would not be the last time that Joab would kill someone to advance his agenda. And what's even more tragic is the fact that David would exploit this wicked characteristic of Joab for David's own wicked purposes. You see, Joab would become an accomplice in the murder of Bathsheba's husband, Uriah the Hittite. Let's go back to 2 Samuel chapter 11. Now, you'll remember we read 2 Samuel 11 verse 1, which tells us that this is sometime later. Joab and the armies of Israel, they went out to the battlefield, but David remains in Jerusalem. Now, we know the rest of that story. You know, it starts with a lustful look at while Bathsheba's bathing on the roof. It leads to David committing adultery with Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah the Hittite. And then Bathsheba gets pregnant. And when she informs David that she's pregnant, 2 Samuel chapter 11 verse 6 says that David sends word to Joab, and David tells Joab, send me Uriah the Hittite. And so Joab, he sends Uriah from the battlefield. He sends Uriah back home to David. And what David tries to do is get Uriah to spend the night with Bathsheba so that everyone would think that Uriah was the father of the child that Bathsheba's carrying. But see, David has a problem now. He underestimates the integrity of Uriah. Uriah, he sees that all of his comrades, they're sleeping out there in open fields in the battle, and yet he's going to go home and sleep with his wife? No, he's unwilling to do that. And so David has to go to plan B. And plan B is David tries to get Uriah drunk so that Uriah would lose his inhibitions and then go home and spend the night with Bathsheba. But when that plan fails, what does David do? David engineers a hidden agenda of his own. We read in verse 15 that he gives a letter to Uriah, and he instructs Uriah to go back to the battlefield and hand deliver this letter to Joab. And the letter instructed Joab, set Uriah in the forefront of the hardest fighting, and then draw back from him that he may be struck down and die. And how did Joab respond to this request? Did Joab write David back and say, how could you even suggest that I do this? Did Joab send word back to David? I'm not going to do this. I refuse to be an accomplice in what is out and out murder, David. No, that's not what Joab does. Verse 16 says that Joab did it, that he assigned Uriah to the place in the fighting where he knew there were valiant men, brave men, where the fighting would be heaviest, where it's not likely you're going to survive. And that's exactly what happened. Just as David planned, Uriah the Hittite dies in the battle, and Joab sends a messenger back to David to tell him what happened. Now, go to chapter 11 of 2 Samuel, and let's read verses 19 through 21. This is very, very interesting, verses 19 through 21. It says, this is Joab talking here, and it says, and Joab instructed the messenger, when you have finished telling all the news about the fighting to the king, then if the king's anger rises, and if he says to you, why did you go so near the city to fight? Did you not know they would shoot from the wall? Who killed Abimelech the son of Jerubbesheth? Did not a woman cast an upper millstone on him from the wall so that he died at Thebez? Why did you go so near the wall? Then you shall say, your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead also. That's very interesting because it tells us that Joab anticipated that David might get angry to hear that David's soldiers had come so close to the wall, and therefore there were so many casualties. And that's why Joab told the messenger that if the king got angry, the messenger was to tell him, well, Uriah the Hittite is dead also. Why was Joab so willing to participate in the murder of an innocent man? I think the answer lies in the root of Joab's obsession to be in a position of prominence and power. You see, Joab's a smart man. Joab knows that a scandal in David's kingdom could cost David his throne. And if David's no longer king, it's pretty likely that Joab would no longer be the military captain. A new king might put someone else in charge of all of his armies. So as far as Joab is concerned, it's in Joab's best interest to keep David on the throne. And not only that, now Joab has a powerful piece of information about David that he might be able to use to manipulate David in the future. You see, that's what people with hidden agendas do. They are always looking for tools they can use to accomplish what they want to get done. And so Joab didn't have a problem in being an accomplice to the murder of Uriah, because that was not necessarily Joab doing a favor to David so much as it was an act of selfishness on Joab's part, because what Joab was always concerned with was how something would either help him or hurt him personally. Brethren, within the church today and in our country and in our society, there are people with hidden selfish agendas, and a lot of the time They are always looking for information that they can use against others so that they can manipulate them into doing what they want them to do. They are constantly in the fault finding mode because they can, if they find faults, they can use those faults as ammunition to turn people against their brothers and sisters in Christ who don't share the same agenda. And that is very, very sad. It's very destructive to their brethren. It's very destructive to the church as a whole, and it's destructive to a society as well. So, what have we learned so far? What Joab teaches us is that instead of advancing our own personal agenda, we need to deny ourselves. We need to pursue God's agenda for our lives. We need to take up the cross daily and follow Jesus. Luke 9, verse 23. Christians, we need to have an agenda. I'm not denying that, but here's what our agenda needs to be. We need to let our light shine before others so that they may see our good works and glorify God who is in heaven, as Jesus said in Matthew 5, verse 16. The only agenda we need to have is to fear God and keep his commandments. The only agenda we need to have is to be steadfast, immovable, always abounding, not in our work to advance what we want, but always abounding in the work of the Lord. Now, let's continue our study of Joab's life. There are other things that took place in Joab's life that would prove his hidden agenda. For example, the murder of David's son Absalom. And what we're going to see is that Joab directly murdered David's son Absalom, but even before that, he was scheming and meddling in the affairs of Absalom's life, all for his own personal benefit. Go over to chapter 13 of 2 Samuel. Now, when you read chapter 13, what you're going to read about is how Absalom had a brother. The brother's name was Ammon. Absalom and Amnon also had a sister whose name was Tamar. Now, Amnon, Absalom's brother, actually raped his sister Tamar. And so Absalom, he orders Amnon to be murdered in revenge. Now, once Amnon is murdered, and Absalom had directed the murder, Absalom, he flees. He becomes a fugitive. And for 3 years, Absalom was alienated from his father David. He was alienated from Jerusalem. Now, in chapter 14 of 2 Samuel, we will read that Joab was personally interested in bringing about a reconciliation between David and Absalom. Now, there are at least two reasons why Joab wanted David and Absalom to reconcile. First, Joab knew that David really, really wanted Absalom back in his life. David longed to be reconciled with his son. And if Joab could make that happen, then Joab would appear to be the hero in David's eyes. And this would help Joab's overall long-term relationship with the king, especially since Joab remembers that David's not happy with him for murdering Abner. And so because of this, what does Joab do? Once in a while, he looks for ways to smooth out the rough edges of the relationship between him and David. For example, in chapter 12, verse 28 of 2 Samuel, Joab encouraged David to come to a conquered city. And the reason he wants David to come, he tells David, you need to come here, lest I, Joab, take the city and it be called by my name. Now, was that a magnanimous gesture, or was that trying to openly get in on David's good side? I think it was Joab trying to get in on David's good side. So Joab's trying to reconcile David and his son Absalom because he wants to get back into David's good graces. But there's probably another reason as well. If David and Absalom could be reconciled and again be on good terms with each other, that would mean that Absalom would almost certainly become the next king. Go to chapter 14 of 2 Samuel, Look at verse 25, 2 Samuel 14, verse 25. You'll read in that verse that Absalom was a very handsome young man. Now, Joab knows this. Joab knows that physical attractiveness and positions of power, they often go hand in hand. And that's why Absalom would be a very popular choice among the people to be their next king. So what's Joab want to do? He wants to get in on good terms with Absalom so that when and if Absalom would become king in the future, he would keep Joab as his military commander. And so Joab, not surprisingly, he employs deception in initiating his agenda to restore Absalom to David's good graces. Go to chapter 14. 2 Samuel 14, if you read the first 23 verses, you'll read how Joab persuaded a woman to put on mourning clothes and come to David and pretend to be in mourning. The Bible says that Joab even gave a false story to this woman to give to David. She tells David that her husband's dead. She tells David that one of her sons had killed her other son while fighting in the field. And she also tells David that her entire family was trying to get her to turn over the son who had killed her other son so that they might punish him to death. And she claims to David that she's reluctant to do this. Why? Because it would completely extinguish her offspring from earth. And so she asked David to see to it that none of the avengers of blood would destroy her son. Now, how does David respond to this story? Look at verse 11. David says to this woman, "As the Lord lives, not one hair of your son shall fall to the ground." And once the woman heard this, look at what she says next. She immediately accuses David of being inconsistent. Look at verse 13. She says, "Why then have you planned such a thing against the people of God? For in giving this decision, the king convicts himself, inasmuch as the king does not bring his banished one home again." See what Joab did here? Joab, using this woman and the made-up story that he told this woman to tell David, Joab puts David into a corner now. So David hears this. Look at verse 19. He senses that Joab was the one behind this, that Joab had put her up to this charade. Verse 19, he even asked her if Joab was behind it. Christians, there's something we can learn from this. People who have hidden agendas, they often hide behind the work of others to get what they want. They often put words in other people's mouths. They often lurk in the shadows while others do their dirty work for them. And they stir things up behind the scenes. Now look at this case. Notice that what Absalom had done to his brother was not even close to what the woman said was about her two sons in the story that Joab made up for her. You see, in her story, the death of her son was not premeditated. Absalom, on the other hand, certainly premeditated his brother's murder. But look at verse 21. Verse 21 says that David commanded Joab to go bring Absalom back again. Joab's response to this is evidence that his main agenda in doing all this was once again to get on his king's good side. Verse 22 says that he fell to the ground on his face, he bowed, and he proclaimed that he had found grace in the eyes of David again. So Absalom comes back to Jerusalem, but the Bible also says that even though Absalom's back in Jerusalem, he does not see the face of his father David for 2 whole years. So while this is going on, during these 2 years, Absalom sends for Joab, and he asks Joab to come see him twice, but Joab refuses to come. So this seems to strengthen the idea that Joab wasn't nearly as concerned about Absalom as he had pretended to be before Absalom came back to Jerusalem. Because at this point in time, Joab is more concerned about David, because David's the one in power right now. He's not as concerned about Absalom. Absalom had not yet come into power. But nonetheless, if you keep reading, you'll see that the Bible brings out that Absalom found a way to get Joab's attention. What did he do? Absalom sets Joab's fields on fire. And so this finally motivates Joab to have a meeting with Absalom. And so at their meeting, Absalom presses Joab to arrange a face-to-face meeting with his father David. And so, after 5 long years of separation, Absalom and his father David, they finally meet again. They seem to reconcile, but if you keep reading, the Bible goes on to report that in reality, Absalom gets to work on a hidden agenda of his own. And Absalom's agenda was, I want my father's throne. I'm going to take David's throne away from him. Go to chapter 15 of 2 Samuel. In 2 Samuel chapter 15, if you were to read the first 17 verses, you'll read that Absalom was trying, and he was succeeding, to steal away the hearts of the men of Israel from David. You'll read that Absalom sends spies all throughout the whole country telling them, when you get a certain signal, I want you to proclaim me, Absalom, to be king. And when that happens, this forces David to flee Jerusalem and go someplace far away. Now, when that happens, Absalom chooses one of David's nephews, a cousin of Joab's, a man by the name of Amasa, to be his military captain instead of Joab. And we'll see later in this lesson that Amasa would later become another one of Joab's victims. But in the meantime, while this is happening, David divides his soldiers into thirds. He puts a third of them under Joab, a third of them under Joab's brother Abishai, and a third of them under another man. So there's a battle coming now between David's forces and Absalom's forces. And David knows that this battle is about to come. And so he sends for Joab, and he gives Joab some very special instructions. Not just Joab, but the other commanders as well. In chapter 18 of 2 Samuel, look at verse 5. What did David specifically tell Joab and everyone else to do? Deal gently for my sake with the young man Absalom. And so now the battle starts that same day. It ends with 20,000 soldiers dying. David's forces are getting the upper hand. So while the battle's taking place, Absalom, he's riding on a donkey, and his head becomes caught in the branches of a pretty large oak tree. Now, the historian Josephus says that it was Absalom's very famously thick hair that got tangled in the branches of this oak tree. The donkey keeps on going and leaves Absalom hanging in the branches, completely suspended off the ground. You read that in verse 9 of 2 Samuel 18. So someone sees Absalom in this helpless position, and he runs and he tells Joab about it. Now look at what Joab says in response in verse 11 of 2 Samuel 18. Joab says to this messenger, "What, you saw him? Why then did you not strike him there to the ground? I would have been glad to give you 10 pieces of silver and a belt." So what does this tell us about Joab? Again, all Joab cares about is accomplishing his agenda. He doesn't care about what David wanted. He cares about pursuing his own interests. Remember, David had specifically commanded that nothing bad happen to Absalom. The person who informed Joab, he knows this. And he tells Joab, I'm not going to harm Absalom, even if you were to give me 1,000 shekels of silver, because the king had explicitly commanded all of us to not harm Absalom. If only Joab cared as much about authority as this guy did. See, what we see here in Joab's actions is that people who have personal agendas, they can digress to the point that they publicize their lack of respect for authority. See, Joab was aware of David's orders about Absalom. He knew that David had publicly said, deal gently with the young man Absalom. But Joab doesn't care about that. Joab is going to do what he wants to do no matter what. Within our society and within the church, people who have personal agendas, they'll start out trying to work quietly in the background at first, but if that doesn't get the job done, they'll often go public with their rebellion. And when they do, a lot of the time, they'll create a kind of line in the sand moment. And in other words, they'll usually compel their brethren to choose a side, and this almost always leads to a split in that church. So, what does Joab do? He dismisses this informant as unworthy of any more of his time, and then he takes 3 darts in his hand, and he finds Absalom hanging in that tree, and he thrusts those darts through Absalom's heart while Absalom is still alive hanging in that oak tree. And not only that, the Bible says that 10 young men who were Joab's armor bearers, they surround Absalom and they struck him and they killed him. Now, what did David say? David said, deal gently with Absalom. There was nothing gentle about the way that Absalom died. It's almost as if Joab went out of his way to do the opposite of what David has said. What Joab essentially did was torture Absalom before he killed him. He dealt cruelly, not gently, with Absalom. So what can we learn from what Joab did here? People with personal agendas, a lot of times, they're very cruel in the way they accomplish their agendas. They don't seem to care who they hurt. They don't seem to care how much they hurt them, as long as they can achieve their personal goals. That sense of ambition that people with personal agendas have, that sense of ambition overrides any compassion that they might have, and that is very, very sad. We can also learn something from Joab getting his armor bearers to help him murder Absalom. You see, people who have personal agendas, they're not bashful about recruiting others to help them carry out those agendas. This happens in the church sometimes, and when it does, it almost always contributes to that church growing weaker and then dying. I wish that everyone in the church would work as hard at evangelizing the lost as they do proselytizing others to assist them in their hidden agendas. If that happened, churches would not be dying, they would be growing. And I'm speaking generally here. I want to clarify. I know that there are many, many sound and faithful and hardworking congregations out there, and I don't want to give the impression that there aren't. But we do have a problem in some congregations. I've seen it, and there have been many who have shared with me their own sad experiences of those within the church only caring about their own desires, their own agendas, and causing harm and division in the church as a result. These are lessons from Joab that we can learn and apply to our own relationships in the church and our own lives as well. So, Absalom is now dead. And so Joab blows a trumpet to end the battle. There's a man by the name of Ahimaaz, and the Bible implies that Ahimaaz was usually a messenger who brought David good military tidings. So Ahimaaz requests permission from Joab to run and tell David the news of victory. But you see, Joab knows that David's going to be most interested to know about what happened to Absalom. And he also knows that David sometimes had put to death messengers who had brought him news that they thought he would be pleased with, only to find out that he wasn't pleased with it too late. You can read about that at the beginning of 2 Samuel. So what Joab does is he sends a Cushite, in other words, an Ethiopian, probably an Ethiopian slave of Joab's. He sends this Cushite to run and inform David instead, probably because he doesn't want to risk losing Ahimaaz. Can you imagine being the one to tell David about what had happened to his son. And who put that Cushite in that terrible position? It was Joab. So that teaches us something else. Those who have personal agendas, a lot of times they create unnecessary burdens that other people have to bear. How many unnecessary problems exist in a congregation all because of someone's personal agenda? How many lost sheep would shepherds be able to find if they weren't so busy trying to keep the church together because of problems like this? How much help could more members of the church give to church leaders in looking for lost sheep if we were all interested in others' souls instead of our own agendas? How much more work could be done in the church if division was not looming as it takes place in some congregations because of problems like this? Yes, there's a lot we can learn from Joab here. So after the Cushite leaves to give David the bad news, Ahimaaz, he says, Joab, give me permission, let me go ahead and run after him. Now Joab, he tries to dissuade Ahimaaz from going, but Ahimaaz, he insists, he wants to go, and so Joab lets him go. Now Ahimaaz, running on level land, Ahimaaz actually gets to David before the Cushite did. So when he gets there, what does David do? He immediately asks about Absalom. Now Ahimaaz, he decides not to answer David. Now maybe Ahimaaz didn't know what happened to Absalom. Maybe Ahimaaz just wants to avoid the question. But when the Cushite arrives, David asks him about Absalom. And in 2 Samuel chapter 18, verse 32, the Cushite says, "May the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise up against you for evil be like that young man." So when David hears this, he's deeply moved. He goes up to his private chamber and he just weeps and cries. He cries out, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would I had died instead of you, O Absalom, my son, my son." Now here's the thing. When Joab hears that David is weeping and mourning for his son, when Joab hears that no one is rejoicing over the victory, but instead everyone's in mourning because the people had heard how grieved David was over the death of his son, what does Joab do? 2 Samuel chapter 19, starting with verse 5. If you read that, you'll read about how Joab comes to David while David is mourning for his son, and Joab actually has the tenacity to rebuke David. He says, "You have today covered with shame the faces of all your servants who have this day saved your life and the lives of your family." Now, that if these words weren't stinging enough, notice what Joab goes on to say. He says, "Because you love those who hate you and hate those who love you. For you have made it clear today that commanders and servants are nothing to you. For today I know that if Absalom were alive and all of us were dead today, then you would be pleased." Man, that is cold. I think what Joab doesn't realize is that just because Joab's a cold-hearted, compassionless, I'm in it only for me kind of guy, that doesn't mean that David has to be that way. The fact that David is mourning the loss of his son, that didn't mean that David had no appreciation whatsoever for everyone who had fought and died to protect David and his family that day. Joab's completely unfair here. It's completely unfair for Joab to accuse David of loving his enemies and hating his friends merely because he's anguished that his own son died. Not only that, Joab is acting hypocritically here because it's very, very inconsistent for the man who was the very one who had caused David's grief. Joab was the one who chose to murder Absalom. It's very, very hypocritical for Joab, of all people, to start hurling accusations at the king when Joab was the one who had explicitly disobeyed the king's orders. And this teaches us something else about people who have agendas. A lot of times they are very quick to blame and even accuse others for problems that they themselves have started. You look at Ahab, for example. Ahab called Elijah the prophet, you troubler of Israel. Elijah wasn't the one who caused all the problems in Israel. It was Ahab who had done that. And Joab does the very same thing here. And within the church, whenever you have someone who is stirring up contention and division, a lot of times that division is caused by someone who will blame others for why the division exists, and they will lament the division, and they just fail to see that oftentimes they're the ones who actually cause the division. Now let's keep reading. Joab, again, his agenda that was all about promoting himself, we'll see that agenda further in another episode of his life that is described to us later on when he murders a man by the name of Amasa. Now, after Absalom's murder, Joab had probably thought that his plan had worked, that his position as David's military commander was secure. But chapter 19, we read that he's in for a rude awakening, because starting in verse 13 of 2 Samuel 19, we'll read that David tells his priest to get his nephew Amasa so that he can make Amasa military captain instead of Joab. Probably David found out that Joab had murdered his son, and so now he's wanting to punish Joab. And then you go to chapter 20 of 2 Samuel, and we read of a new conspiracy against David and his throne. The culprit this time is a man by the name of Sheba. Now David sees Sheba's attempts to take his throne from him as a pretty serious threat, so he decides to send the military after him. But he doesn't call on Joab to stop Sheba. Instead, he calls on his new commander, Amasa, to gather all the troops together and report back within 3 days. Now, Amasa, he wasn't able to meet back with David at the appointed time, so David decides to proceed without him. But David still doesn't call for Joab's assistance. Instead, he calls for Joab's brother Abishai and commands him to take care of Sheba. Now, somehow, probably because Abishai told him, Joab finds out about all this. So Joab and his men join the search for Sheba. And while they're looking for Sheba, they run into Amasa. Now here's what Joab does. He goes up to greet Amasa, and as he does, his sword kind of falls out of his sheath. Now most likely Joab had planned this, but it must have looked like an accident to Amasa. Besides, remember, Amasa and Joab were cousins. Why would Amasa think that Joab would harm him? But that's exactly what Joab does, because what we're reading here is that while Joab asks Amasa if he's in good health, he takes Amasa by the beard as if to kiss him, and then he takes his sword in his other hand, and he stabs Amasa in the fifth rib so that all of his entrails come out on the ground. Amasa never saw it coming. So what do we see here? We see again Joab killing someone whom he sees as a potential threat and obstacle to his ambition to remain military captain of all of David's forces. He's even willing to kill his own cousin. What does that teach us, Christians? People who have personal agendas, sometimes they'll go so far as to turn on their own relatives to achieve their personal goals. How often we see it in the church that some Christians are more loyal to their families than they are to Christ, but there's a flip side to that too. There are times when brethren have been enticed into following some Christian's personal agenda, and they've decided to turn against other family members who refuse to go along with it. I've seen it where some family members selfishly insist on pursuing their own personal agenda. They want to live like they want to live, even if it destroys the relationship they have with their family members who still love God and the Bible. How sad that is. So here you have Amasa has been killed by his own cousin Joab, and while Amasa is still soaking in his own blood, 2 Samuel chapter 20 verse 11, we see that Joab takes charge of the military as if David had never demoted him. And one of Joab's men draws a line in the sand, and he insists that anyone still loyal to David would also be loyal to Joab. Never mind the fact that David had removed Joab from being commander, and which would mean that if you really truly were loyal to David, you would reject Joab. Never mind that. The suggestion that rejecting Joab would mean that you're rejecting David, that's not only false, but it was also an effective way to put pressure on people who wanted to be loyal to David. It was making them feel like, well, if I'm going to be loyal to David, I have to be loyal to Joab if I'm going to be loyal to David. A similar thing happens today. We see it in our country right now. We see it in our society. And sometimes it happens in the church too. People who seek to promote a particular agenda, a lot of times they'll recruit their supporters by telling them that if you want to be faithful to God, or if you want to stand for what is right, then you have to go along with what I want. And a lot of times that's not actually true. A lot of times what they're wanting is not a matter of God's will as revealed in the Bible. It's just their own personal opinion, their own personal preference. But people sometimes go along with it. This is something else we can learn from Joab. So now Amasa is out of the way, so the soldiers do follow Joab and his brother Abishai. They locate Sheba in a certain town. They began battering down the walls of that city. In chapter 20 of 2 Samuel, starting with verse 16, you can read about how a pretty wise woman inside the city, she knows that something has to be done here. So she calls out to Joab, and she says, hey, Joab, please listen to me. And she tells Joab that she had figured out that it would be better for the residents of the city to cut off Sheba's head and throw it over the wall of the city rather than harbor him as a fugitive and get caught up in the conflict. And so she pleads with Joab for peace, and she asks Joab to not swallow up the city. Look at how Joab responds to her in verse 20. I think it's very remarkable. He says to this woman, far be it from me, far be it that I should swallow up or destroy. Far be it from me, far be it that I should swallow up or destroy. I think that's amazing that this man of all people would say something like this. Everything we've studied in his life so far shows that no, it's not far-fetched at all to imagine him swallowing up and destroying human life. He did it with Abner, he did it with Uriah, he did it with Absalom, and he did it with Amasa, and yet he still has the audacity to say, far be it from me that I should swallow up and destroy. That's what he's most remembered for. And see, this teaches us something else, Christians. It goes to show that people who have personal agendas, a lot of times they deceive themselves. A lot of times they don't see themselves as who they really are. This happens in the church today. It happens in our society too. There are some who are genuinely convinced that they're doing the church, they're doing the brotherhood, they're doing even God a service by pushing their private agenda. But what did Jesus tell us, brother? Jesus told us in John chapter 16, verse 2, that some who killed his disciples would think that they were doing God a service, when in reality they weren't. Paul himself, remember when he was Saul of Tarsus? He was convinced that it was God's will that he persecute Christianity. But was he right? No, he was wrong. Fortunately for him, he quite literally saw the light. 2 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 5 tells us to examine ourselves honestly, Christians. We need to examine ourselves with honesty to make sure that we see ourselves as we really are. That's another lesson we can learn from Joab. So as the years went on, We see other evidence of Joab's self-serving ambition guiding his every move. And chapter 24 of 2 Samuel, on one occasion, he actually gives some pretty good advice to David concerning whether David should make a census for his people. Now, if you read chapter 24, you'll see that David goes ahead and makes the census, and that ends up angering God. And Joab was the one who said to David, David, you shouldn't do this. I think Joab must have known something about David's reasons for making the census, that something about his reasons was contrary to the will of God. So why did he do it? Why did Joab just suddenly stand up for what was right instead of doing what was wrong here? I would love to say that Joab had finally been converted to God's word in all things, but I think another possibility, considering how we've seen how Joab's spent his entire life being self-centered here, I think another possibility is that Joab was very much aware that God would be angry with Israel about this census, and maybe show that anger by allowing Israel to be defeated on the battlefield. Maybe God would take David's throne away from him, and that would affect Joab very personally in a bad way. But whatever the case, the fact that after we've seen so many sins that Joab has committed, all in the name of promoting his private agenda, the fact that that would lead us to question Joab when Joab actually does something right, well, that teaches us something else. Those who have a reputation for advancing their own personal agenda, they can cause people to wonder what their motives are even when they are promoting the right thing. Remember what Jesus said? He said, by their fruits you shall know them, Matthew 7, verse 20. There might be times when someone in the church might have a good suggestion. Maybe they might even have a justifiable objection to a decision that has been made. But if that person has the reputation of rebelliously seeking their own way all the time at the expense of the church, then their credibility is severely damaged, even when they're promoting the right thing to do. That's a lesson and a warning for us as well. There's one more episode in Joab's life I would like for us to look at, and that's when David is about to die. If you go to chapter 1 of 1 Kings, you will record that when David's about to die, one of his sons, a man by the name of Adonijah, he decides that he's going to be king. And so he conspires with Joab and a priest by the name of Abiathar to make that happen. Now, not everyone supports this, but Adonijah doesn't care. He is going to schedule an invitation-only party to inaugurate his reign, as it were. Now, fortunately, the prophet Nathan was aware that God had already decided that David's son Solomon would be the next king. So Nathan tells Bathsheba about what Adonijah was doing. And so what Bathsheba and Nathan do, they get together and they tell David what's going on. And so David decides to act quickly to make Solomon king. And if you go to 1 Kings chapter 1, verse 40, he gets all the people to shout very loudly with trumpets blowing, God save King Solomon. So while this is going on, Adonijah and Joab, they're still at their party. And then suddenly they hear all this commotion. Now Joab, he doesn't know what's going on, but soon he hears that David has made Solomon king. Well, obviously the party's over now. The party's certainly ruined. The guests immediately get up and they run off because they don't want to be associated now with Adonijah because what Adonijah's doing is treasonous. And Adonijah, what he does is he immediately goes to the altar and he takes hold of the horns that are in the altar. The reason he does that is because under the law of Moses, in Exodus chapter 21, verse 14, it says that anyone guilty of unintentional manslaughter could save his life from vengeance by taking hold of the horns of the altar. So what Solomon does, he grants Adonijah a temporary pardon and then sends him on his way. But then later, as David's dying, if you go to chapter 2, verses 5 and 6 of 1 Kings, David's dying. He calls Solomon in to give him some last-minute advice. And a significant portion of what he tells Solomon is all about Joab. Let's go to 1 Kings chapter 2, and let's read what David says about Joab, starting with verse 5. He tells Solomon, "Moreover, you also know what Joab the son of Zeruiah did to me, how he dealt with the two commanders of the armies of Israel, Abner the son of Ner and Amasa the son of Jether, whom he killed, avenging in time of peace for blood that had been shed in war, and putting the blood of war on the belt around his waist and on the sandals of his feet. Act therefore according to your wisdom, but do not let his gray head go down to Sheol in peace." See, now we know what David really thought about Joab. Joab's time of grace is running out. David's on his deathbed, and maybe now he realizes that he should have done something about Joab a long time ago. And he doesn't want Solomon to have to go through the same grief that Joab put him through. So if you keep reading, we read that Adonijah, he doesn't honor his agreement to not rebel against Solomon's authority. And so Solomon sends a soldier by the name of Benaiah, the man that David had appointed to take Joab's place as a military captain. Solomon sends Benaiah to put Adonijah to death. Joab hears this. He hears that Benaiah has killed Adonijah. So Joab now sees the writing on the wall. He knows what's about to happen. So in 1 Kings chapter 2, verse 28, he runs to the tabernacle and he grabs hold of the horns of the altar. Solomon hears about this, and he orders Benaiah, "I want you to go and I want you to kill Joab." So Benaiah, he gets to where Joab is, and he orders Joab to leave the altar. Joab refuses. Joab says, "No, I'm going to die here." Maybe Joab's hoping that as long as he clung to the altar, they could never kill him in such a holy place as the tabernacle. In fact, we do read that Benaiah was reluctant to kill Joab while he was still clutching the horns of the altar. And so he tells Solomon what's going on. Solomon's not about to be held hostage to Joab here. And so Solomon orders Benaiah to kill Joab, even if Joab remains at the altar, and that's exactly what happened. So from these last actions of Joab's life, we get yet another lesson about those who have personal agendas. A lot of times they give themselves false hope because of their misinterpretation of Scripture. You see, Joab knew from Exodus chapter 21 that the law of Moses offered pardon to those who fled to the altar. But if he had read Exodus 21 verses 13 and 14, he would have known that it does not apply to the man who had deliberately murdered someone like Joab did. Not only that, if Joab had understood Deuteronomy chapter 19, verses 10 through 13, he would have known that one guilty of deliberately shedding blood like him could not escape punishment. See, that reminds me of the Pharisees in the New Testament. The Pharisees knew Scripture a lot, but they oftentimes misapplied the Scripture, and they ignored other Scriptures completely. That's what Jesus rebuked them for in Matthew 23, verse 23. Hosea said in Hosea chapter 4, verse 6, "My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge." That's a big problem in the church today, lack of knowledge. We all need to continually make sure that we are always studying God's Word, broadening the horizons of our knowledge, and properly applying what we learn from God's Word to our lives. So, as we close out this study of the life of Joab, what have we learned? Instead of advancing our own personal agenda, we must deny ourselves. We must pursue God's agenda for our lives. Again, we must deny ourselves, take up the cross, and follow him. Luke 9:23. We must make our agenda this: to let our light shine before others so that they may see our good works and glorify God as a result. Matthew 5, verse 16. The only agenda, Christians, that we need to have is to fear God and keep his commandments, to be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, to do the work of the Lord with a humble heart. And above all, our main agenda needs to be to love God with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love our neighbor the same way we love ourselves. Let all we do be done in love, not in hate, and not to serve our own wants and desires. Let us not be like Joab. Let us be like Christ. Thank you so much for going along and participating in this study. I hope it was beneficial to you. Again, you can find more biblical material at our website, calhounchurchofchrist.com. If you have any questions or would like to have a Bible study or participate in an online correspondence course, email me, John, at calhounchurchofchrist@gmail.com. May God bless you. Hope you have a